Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm a mother, a part-time nurse, and someone who believed family always comes first. But the day my 5-year-old daughter needed $120,000 to save her life, my parents looked me straight in the eye and said, "We don't have that kind of money." 6 months later, they spent $300,000 on my brother's wedding. Let me ask you something. What would you do if you had to choose between family loyalty and your child's life? It started on a Tuesday morning in March. Emma, my little girl, had been complaining about stomach pains for weeks. I'd taken her to our family doctor twice, and both times he said it was probably just stress from starting kindergarten. "Kids get anxious," he said. "Give it time." But a mother's intuition is rarely wrong, and something deep in my gut told me this wasn't about school nerves. That Tuesday, Emma collapsed during breakfast. One minute she was picking at her cereal, the next she was on the kitchen floor, unconscious. My husband, Jake, was already at work, so I scooped her up and drove to the emergency room like my life depended on it. Because hers did. The ER doctor took one look at Emma's pale, lifeless face and immediately ordered a CT scan, then an MRI, then blood work, then more tests I couldn't even pronounce. Hours passed like centuries. Jake rushed from his construction site, still covered in drywall dust, and we sat in those awful plastic chairs, holding hands and praying to anyone who might be listening. Dr. Martinez finally came out at 8 p.m. I'll never forget the look on his face. That careful, practiced expression doctors wear when they're about to shatter your world. "We need to talk," he said, and those 4 words changed everything. Emma had a rare liver condition called hepatic arteriovenous malformation. The simplified explanation was that blood vessels in her liver were tangled and failing. Without immediate surgery, a complex procedure that only 3 hospitals in the country could perform, she had maybe 6 months to live, maybe less. The surgery would cost $120,000. Our insurance would cover about $85,000, leaving us responsible for $35,000 up front, plus additional costs that could easily push our portion to $50,000 or more. We had $15,000 in our savings account. We'd been so careful, so responsible, putting away money every month for Emma's college fund, for emergencies, for the future we thought we had time to plan. But $50,000 might as well have been $50 million. I called my parents that night from the hospital parking lot. Mom answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar. "Sarah, honey, how are you? We haven't heard from you in weeks." "Mom," I said, and my voice cracked immediately. "Emma's sick, really sick. She needs surgery and we need help." The warmth disappeared from her voice instantly. "Why, what kind of help?" I explained everything, the diagnosis, the surgery, the costs. When I finished, there was silence so long I thought the call had dropped. "Sarah," my father's voice came on the line. He must have been listening on the extension. "That's a lot of money." "I know, Dad, but it's Emma. She's your granddaughter. She's 5 years old." "We understand that," Mom said carefully. "But we've already made financial commitments. Your father's retirement, the house renovations we've been planning. We can't just liquidate everything because—" "Because what?" I interrupted. "Because my daughter is dying? Don't be dramatic," Dad said sharply. "We're not saying we won't help, but $50,000? That's not money we just have lying around. But they did have it. I knew they did. My parents owned their house outright, a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial worth at least $400,000. Dad had been a successful accountant for 30 years before retiring, and Mom had worked as a school principal. They drove new cars, took cruises every year, and never seemed to worry about money. "What about a loan?" I asked desperately. "We could set up payments, whatever you need." "Sarah, you need to understand," Mom said, her voice taking on that patronizing tone I remembered from childhood. "You're an adult now. You have a family. You can't keep running to us every time life gets difficult. You and Jake need to figure this out yourselves." Every time life gets difficult. As if I'd ever asked them for anything before. As if saving my daughter's life was some minor inconvenience I should handle on my own. "What about a second mortgage on our house?" Jake suggested when I told him about the call. "Or borrowing against my 401k? We tried everything." Our house was only worth $180,000, and we still owed $120,000 on the mortgage. The equity wasn't enough. Jake's 401k had $30,000, but the penalties for early withdrawal would eat up most of it. We applied for medical loans, reached out to charities, started a GoFundMe that raised $8,000 from friends and strangers who cared more about Emma than her own grandparents. Meanwhile, Emma got sicker. She couldn't keep food down. Her energy disappeared. The vibrant little girl who used to dance around our living room to Disney songs now spent most of her time sleeping on the couch, too weak to play. I called my parents 3 more times. Each conversation was worse than the last. They'd say they were looking into options, but needed more time. They asked detailed questions about the prognosis, about alternative treatments, about whether we'd gotten second opinions. It was like they were looking for reasons to justify saying no. The final call came 2 weeks after Emma's diagnosis. Mom's voice was cold, businesslike. "Sarah, your father and I have discussed this extensively. We simply cannot commit to this kind of financial obligation. We have our own future to think about. You need to explore other options." "What other options?" I screamed into the phone. "I've tried everything. She's your granddaughter." "Lower your voice," Dad said. "Getting emotional won't solve anything. You're a nurse. You understand medical billing. Work with the hospital on a payment plan." "She'll be dead before we could pay off a payment plan." "Then maybe," Mom said quietly, "you need to consider the possibility that this is God's will." I hung up and cried for 3 hours straight. That's when Jake's parents stepped in. Pete and Linda, who lived in a modest ranch house 40 minutes away, who'd raised 4 kids on a mailman salary and a part-time teaching job. They drove to our house that same evening. "We heard about Emma," Linda said simply. "What do you need?" When we explained the situation, Pete didn't hesitate. "We'll sell the house." "You can't do that," I protested. "Where will you live?" "We'll figure it out," Linda said. "We can rent an apartment, downsize. Emma needs this surgery, and that's what matters." Within 3 weeks, they'd sold their house for $180,000. They paid off their small remaining mortgage, covered the selling costs, and handed us a check for $140,000. "For Emma," Pete said, "and for whatever else you need." The surgery was scheduled for the following month. Emma would spend 3 weeks in the Children's Hospital in Boston, with Jake and me taking turns staying with her around the clock. Pete and Linda moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment across town and never once complained about leaving the home where they'd raised their children and built their memories. Emma's surgery was successful. The recovery was long and difficult, but by Christmas, she was running around again, laughing, asking for seconds at dinner. She was alive because her grandparents, her real grandparents, had sacrificed everything for her. My parents called twice during Emma's recovery. Both times to ask how she was doing, both times managing to sound annoyed that we were still dealing with all this medical drama. They sent a get well card with a $25 gift card to Target. I thought that was the end of it. I thought we'd move on with our lives, grateful for Jake's parents and trying to forget how my own family had abandoned us when we needed them most. I was wrong. 6 months later, I found a thick, elegant envelope in our mailbox. Heavy cardstock, gold foil lettering, the kind of wedding invitation that costs more than most people spend on a week's groceries. My brother Ryan was getting married to his girlfriend of 2 years, and my parents were throwing them the wedding of the century. The invitation was a work of art, embossed gold script on cream-colored paper that felt like silk. It announced a celebration at the Grand View Country Club, cocktail hour at 6, dinner and dancing to follow. Black tie preferred. The RSVP card mentioned guest accommodations at the 4-star hotel next door, with a room block reserved for out-of-town guests. I stood in my driveway, holding this $50 invitation, thinking about the conversation I'd had with my mother 6 months earlier. "We don't have that kind of money," she'd said. "We can't just liquidate everything." That night, I did some research. The Grand View Country Club charged $150 per person for dinner service, plus bar packages, service fees, and gratuities. For the guest list size they were clearly planning, they were looking at $30,000 just for the reception. Add in flowers, photography, music, the rehearsal dinner, and all the other extras that come with a country club wedding, and you're easily into six-figure territory. I called Ryan directly. Hey, Sarah! Did you get the invitation? Pretty fancy, right? It's beautiful, I said carefully. This must be costing Mom and Dad a fortune. Ryan laughed. Yeah, they're going all out. Mom keeps saying it's their only son's wedding, so they want to do it right. The final budget is around $300,000, but they seem happy to spend it. $300,000. They'd told me they couldn't afford $50,000 to save Emma's life, but they could spend 6 times that amount on one day, on one party, on one celebration that would be over in 12 hours. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen, staring at that gold foil invitation, and something inside me broke. Not the gentle breaking that comes with sadness, but the sharp, clean break that comes with clarity. This wasn't about money. It had never been about money. This was about priorities. This was about what and who my parents valued. Emma was alive and healthy, playing in the next room because Pete and Linda had sold their house without a second thought. My parents had $300,000 to spend on a party, but couldn't find $50,000 to save their granddaughter's life. That night, holding that invitation, I realized something that would take me years to fully act on. The people who raised me weren't my real family. Family doesn't choose parties over people. Family doesn't choose status over survival. Real family sells their house so their granddaughter can live. As I watched Emma play with her toys, completely unaware of the calculations of worth that had almost cost her everything, I made a promise. She would never know what it felt like to be considered less important than appearances. She would never wonder if she mattered enough to be saved. But my parents? They were about to learn exactly what their priorities had cost them. Because while they were planning the perfect wedding, I was planning something else entirely. Something that would take time, patience, and the kind of cold calculation they'd shown me when they chose my brother's happiness over my daughter's life. The invitation was beautiful, but it was also evidence. Evidence of what mattered to them, evidence of what they could afford when they wanted to, evidence of the choice they'd made 6 months earlier when they decided a party was more important than a little girl's life. I kept that invitation. In fact, I framed it, right next to Emma's hospital bracelet from her surgery. Because someday, when the time was right, I was going to show the world exactly what my parents' priorities looked like, and they were going to discover that actions have consequences, even when those consequences take years to arrive. The wedding was still 8 months away. That gave me plenty of time to plan. The months leading up to Ryan's wedding were a masterclass in documentation. I didn't set out to build a case against my parents, but that's exactly what I was doing. Every conversation, every social media post, every casual comment from relatives who mentioned the wedding preparations, I started keeping track of it all. It began innocently enough. Mom would call occasionally to check on Emma, and inevitably the conversation would turn to wedding planning. The florist wants $8,000 just for the centerpieces, she'd complain. But Ryan and Jessica have their hearts set on white orchids, and you know how your brother gets when he doesn't get what he wants. $8,000 for flowers, more than half of what we'd been able to save for Emma's surgery before we ran out of options. That does sound expensive, I'd say carefully, making notes on the pad I'd started keeping by the phone. Oh, it is, but your father says this is a once-in-a-lifetime event. We want everything to be perfect. Once in a lifetime. I wrote that phrase down too, right next to the date and time of the call, because apparently granddaughters' lives weren't once in a lifetime. Those happened every day, I guess. The evidence kept piling up. Jessica posted constantly on social media about their engagement photos, shot in Napa Valley, a weekend trip that cost $4,000. The custom wedding dress, designed by someone I'd never heard of but who apparently charged $6,000 for bespoke bridal couture. And the bachelor party, a long weekend in Vegas that Ryan estimated cost $2,500 per person for his 6 groomsmen. I screenshot everything, every Instagram story, every Facebook post, every casual mention of another expense that exceeded what my parents claimed they couldn't afford for Emma's surgery. I created a folder on my computer called Family Priorities and watched it grow week by week. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. My Aunt Carol, Dad's sister, who called me 3 months before the wedding. "Sarah, honey, I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't be offended." "What's that, Aunt Carol?" "Well, your mother mentioned that you and Jake had some medical bills for Emma last year. She said you'd asked them for help, but they just couldn't manage it." I chose my words carefully. "Emma had surgery. Yes, it was expensive." "I'm sure it was. But here's what I don't understand. Your parents asked me to loan them $75,000 for the wedding. They said they wanted to make sure they could give Ryan the perfect day, but their liquid assets were tied up in investments they didn't want to touch." The room spun slightly. They'd borrowed money for the wedding. Not only had they refused to help save Emma's life, but they'd actually gone into debt to throw Ryan a party. "Did you loan them the money?" I asked. "I did. Family helps family, right? But then your cousin mentioned that they'd also borrowed from Uncle Bill and Aunt Margaret. I started wondering just how much this wedding is actually costing." That night, I called Uncle Bill directly. We'd always been close. He was the uncle who taught me to drive, who gave the best Christmas presents, who remembered everyone's birthdays without fail. "Uncle Bill, Aunt Carol mentioned that Mom and Dad borrowed money for Ryan's wedding." "Oh, yeah. They needed $50,000, said it was temporary just until they could liquidate some investments without taking a tax hit. I was happy to help." $50,000. The exact amount Emma's surgery would have cost us after insurance. They borrowed from other family members too? I think so. Your dad mentioned something about wanting to make sure they could do this right, even if it meant leveraging a bit. You know how your parents are about appearances. Yes, I knew exactly how they were about appearances. Over the next few weeks, I discreetly reached out to other relatives. The picture that emerged was staggering. Mom and Dad had borrowed over $200,000 from family members to fund Ryan's wedding, telling each lender that it was temporary, that they had the assets but needed time to access them without penalties. The same excuse they'd given me. The same excuse that had been a lie when Emma was dying and was apparently still a lie when it came to paying for orchid centerpieces and open bars. I started keeping a spreadsheet. Date, source, amount borrowed, stated reason. By the time I was finished, I had documented evidence that my parents had access to over $400,000 in borrowing capacity from family members alone, money they could have accessed in weeks, not months. Money they'd had no problem asking for when it came to a party. But I needed more than financial records. I needed something that would make people understand the human cost of their choices. That's when I remembered Dr. Martinez. I called his office and explained what I needed. "Dr. Martinez, would you be willing to write a letter confirming the urgency of Emma's condition last year? Something that explains how time-sensitive her surgery was?" "Of course," he said immediately. "That little girl was very sick, Sarah. Without that surgery, she would have had maybe 4 to 6 months. The fact that anyone would delay treatment for financial reasons..." He trailed off. "Yes, I'll write that letter." The letter arrived a week later on official hospital letterhead. Dr. Martinez had written 3 pages detailing Emma's condition, the urgency of the surgery, and the consequences of delay. He specifically noted that any postponement of treatment beyond 8 to 10 weeks would have significantly decreased the patient's chances of survival. 8 to 10 weeks. My parents had taken 6 weeks just to give us their final no. I also reached out to Pete and Linda, Jake's parents, who were now settled in their small apartment. They'd never complained about downsizing, never mentioned the sacrifices they'd made, but I wanted their side of the story documented. "Would you be comfortable writing down what happened last year?" I asked Linda. "How you decided to sell the house, what that meant for you?" "Of course, dear, though I'm not sure why you need it written down. We did what any grandparent would do." That phrase, "what any grandparent would do," became the title of Linda's 2-page letter. She wrote about getting the call about Emma's diagnosis, about the immediate decision to sell their house, about never considering any alternative. "Peter and I never discussed whether we could afford to help," she wrote. "We only discussed how quickly we could make it happen." The contrast was devastating. As the wedding approached, I made one final decision. I was going to attend, not because I wanted to celebrate, but because I wanted to see it. I wanted to witness exactly what $300,000 looked like when it was more important than a child's life. The wedding was everything the invitation had promised and more. The Grandview Country Club had been transformed into something out of a magazine. White orchids everywhere. Not just centerpieces, but arches, garlands, arrangements that must have required a florist's entire greenhouse. Crystal chandeliers threw rainbow light across tables set with china that probably cost more per place setting than most people spent on groceries in a month. The photographer, there were actually 3 photographers, plus a videographer, moved through the crowd like a small army, capturing every detail of this $300,000 investment in once-in-a-lifetime memories. I sat at a table near the back with Jake, Emma, and his parents, watching my parents work the room. Dad looked distinguished in his rented tuxedo, Mom radiant in a mother-of-the-groom dress that probably cost more than our monthly mortgage payment. They were glowing with pride, accepting congratulations from 200 guests, basking in the compliments about the absolutely perfect celebration they'd created. Emma, now 6 and completely healthy, fidgeted in her flower girl dress. "Mommy, why is everything so fancy?" "Because sometimes people think fancy things are more important than other things," I said, watching my parents pose for photos with Ryan and Jessica. "More important than what?" "More important than what really matters." The speeches began during dinner. Uncle Bill stood first, raising his glass. "To Richard and Margaret, who've given us all a celebration we'll never forget. The love they've poured into this day shows in every detail." Love. I looked around at the orchids, the crystal, the 5-course meal being served by an army of waitstaff. Then I looked at Pete and Linda sitting quietly in their discount store formal wear, the grandparents who'd sold their house without a second thought. Dad's speech came last. He stood at the head table, resplendent in his tuxedo, and cleared his throat. "Friends, family, thank you for joining us on this perfect day. Margaret and I wanted to give Ryan and Jessica something special, something that reflects how much family means to us. No expense has been spared because when it comes to family, nothing is too good, nothing is too much. When it comes to family, nothing is too much." I felt Jake's hand squeeze mine under the table. He'd heard it too. The same man who'd told me we needed to figure this out ourselves when Emma was dying was now declaring that nothing is too much for family. But I didn't make a scene. I didn't stand up, didn't cause a confrontation. I smiled, applauded, and took mental notes. Because my plan had never been about ruining Ryan's wedding. My plan was bigger than that, and it required patience. The wedding ended with fireworks, literal fireworks, synchronized to music that probably cost more than our car. As we drove home, Emma asleep in the back seat, Jake finally spoke. "How do you do it? How do you sit there and listen to all that without losing your mind?" "Because," I said, "they don't know what's coming yet." 2 years passed. 2 years of my parents basking in the glory of having thrown the wedding of the century, as Mom called it. 2 years of them paying back the family loans with money they somehow found now that the party was over. 2 years of occasional phone calls where they asked about Emma but never quite seemed to remember why she'd needed surgery in the first place. Emma thrived. She started 2nd grade, joined the soccer team, learned to ride a bike. Every milestone reminded me of what we'd almost lost and what Pete and Linda had saved by refusing to prioritize anything above her life. Then, in December, 2 years after the wedding, Mom called with an invitation. "Sarah, we're having a family Christmas gathering. The whole family, aunts, uncles, cousins, everyone. We want to rebuild some bridges, bring everyone closer together. It's been too long since we've all been in one room." "Why now?" I asked. "Well, your father and I have been thinking about legacy, about family bonds. We realize we may have been distant lately. We want to fix that." What they didn't say, but what I'd heard through the family grapevine, was that Uncle Bill had been asking questions. Questions about when they were going to pay back the money they'd borrowed for the wedding. Questions about the temporary nature of loans that were now 2 years old. Questions that were making family gatherings uncomfortable. They needed to rehabilitate their image. They needed to remind everyone that they were good people, good family members, who'd simply made some difficult financial decisions. "I'll think about it," I told Mom. But I'd already decided, yes, I was going to that Christmas gathering. Because after 2 years of planning, 2 years of waiting, 2 years of watching them enjoy the fruits of their priorities, it was finally time. I spent the next 3 weeks preparing. I created a presentation. Nothing fancy, nothing dramatic. Just facts, dates, amounts, documentation. Dr. Martinez's letter about Emma's condition, Linda's account of selling their house, bank records showing the timeline of my parents borrowing for the wedding, screenshots of social media posts about wedding expenses, phone logs showing when I'd called them for help and when they'd finally refused. I called it Family Investment Priorities, a financial analysis of love in action. The Christmas gathering was held at my parents' house, the same house they'd claimed they couldn't leverage to help save Emma. 37 family members crowded into their living room, dining room, and kitchen. Uncle Bill, Aunt Carol, cousins I hadn't seen in years, Pete and Linda looking slightly uncomfortable among my parents' more affluent relatives. After dinner, Dad stood up with his traditional Christmas speech. Family, he began, is the most important thing in life. Everything we do, every decision we make, should be about family first. That's when I stood up. Dad, since you're talking about family priorities, I thought this might be a good time to share something I've been working on, a little presentation about how families make decisions when it really matters. The room fell silent. Mom's face went pale. Sarah, she said carefully, this is a celebration. Maybe we could discuss whatever this is later, privately. Oh, but this involves everyone here, I said, connecting my laptop to their big screen TV. Because many of you helped make this story possible. The first slide appeared. Family Investment Priorities, a financial analysis of love in action. I started with the basics. Emma's diagnosis, the cost of surgery, our financial situation. I showed them Dr. Martinez's letter, read the key phrases about urgency and survival chances. The room was completely silent. Then I moved to the documentation of my calls to my parents. The dates, the conversations, the final refusal. I read them Dad's exact words. You need to understand, you're an adult now. You can't keep running to us every time life gets difficult. Next came the wedding documentation. The borrowed money, with Uncle Bill's and Aunt Carol's loans highlighted in red. The social media posts about expenses. The final cost breakdown. $300,000, I said, looking directly at my parents. 6 times what it would have cost to save Emma's life. Uncle Bill was staring at the screen. Richard, you told me you needed the money temporarily because your assets were tied up. They were, Dad said weakly. But you had access to $400,000 in family borrowing, I continued, showing the spreadsheet. Money you could have accessed in weeks, not months. Money you had no problem asking for when it came to orchid centerpieces and open bars. The room was shifting. I could feel the energy changing, people starting to put the pieces together. Then I showed them Linda's letter. I read her words. We did what any grandparent would do. Peter and I never discussed whether we could afford to help. We only discussed how quickly we could make it happen. I clicked to the final slide, a side-by-side comparison. On the left, a photo of Pete and Linda's old house with sold across it. On the right, a photo from Ryan's wedding reception with the caption, $300,000, because when it comes to family, nothing is too much. The silence stretched on forever. Finally, Aunt Carol spoke. Margaret, you told me you couldn't help with Emma's surgery because you didn't have the money. We didn't, Mom said desperately. Not liquid assets. But you borrowed money for a wedding, Uncle Bill said slowly. You borrowed my money for a party while your granddaughter was dying. It wasn't like that, Dad protested. The situations were completely different. You're right, I said. They were completely different. One was about saving a life. The other was about throwing a party. And you chose the party. Ryan, who'd been silent through the entire presentation, finally spoke. Sarah, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know about Emma needing surgery when we were planning the wedding. I know you didn't, I said softly. This isn't about you, Ryan. This is about priorities. This is about what happens when people value appearances more than lives. The room erupted. Family members who'd loaned money demanding explanations, others asking how they could have made such a choice. Pete and Linda trying to leave quietly, uncomfortable with the attention but unable to escape the questions about their sacrifice. Through it all, my parents sat frozen, their careful image crumbling in real time. All the social capital they'd built from throwing the perfect wedding evaporating as people realized what they'd prioritized over their granddaughter's life. That night marked the beginning of the end for my parents' position in our family. The story spread beyond the Christmas gathering. Other relatives heard about the choice they'd made, about the wedding they'd funded while Emma fought for her life, about the grandparents who'd sold their house and the grandparents who'd claimed they couldn't help. 3 months later, when my parents' own financial crisis hit, Dad's medical bills from a heart attack combined with some poor investment decisions, they called me first. "Sarah," Mom's voice was small, defeated. "We need to talk." "About what?" "Your father's medical bills, the treatment he needs. We're looking at $80,000 in costs, and our insurance is fighting us. We hoped you might be able to help, or maybe talk to Pete and Linda about a loan." I sat in my kitchen, looking at Emma coloring at the table, healthy and happy and alive because the right grandparents had made the right choice. "Mom," I said finally, "I learned something important from you 2 years ago. I learned that when it comes to financial priorities, family members need to be adults and figure things out themselves." "Sarah, please, this is different." "No," I said. "It's exactly the same. You have a medical crisis, you need money, and you're asking family for help. The only difference is that Dad is 72, not 5. He's had his life. Emma hadn't had hers yet. That's a terrible thing to say. You know what's terrible? Spending $300,000 on flowers and open bars while telling your daughter you can't afford to save your granddaughter's life." I hung up, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt something I'd almost forgotten: peace. A week later, I got a call from Pete. "Sarah, your parents reached out to us about your father's medical bills." "I figured they might." "What did you tell them?" "I told them that Linda and I would consider helping, but only if the money went directly to creating a medical fund for Emma and other grandchildren. Something your parents should have created years ago." It was perfect. Pete and Linda, even in this moment, were thinking about protecting grandchildren. My parents had made their priorities clear. Now they were living with the consequences. Emma looked up from her coloring book. "Mommy, who was that on the phone?" "Just Grandpa Pete, sweetheart. He was checking on us." "I love Grandpa Pete and Grandma Linda." "I know you do, baby. They love you too, more than anything. Because that's what real grandparents do. That's what real family does. They sell their house without a second thought. They don't spend $300,000 on parties while their granddaughter dies. They don't choose appearances over lives. They choose love. Every single time." And 3 years later, sitting in my kitchen with my healthy daughter, I finally understood that the family who raised me wasn't my real family at all. My real family was the one that had chosen Emma's life over everything else. My real family was the one that had shown me what love actually looks like when it matters. The people who spent $300,000 on a wedding while refusing to save their granddaughter's life, they got exactly what they deserved: nothing. Have you ever been silenced by family who claimed they cared but chose their image over your pain? Share your story below. I'll read it and I'll believe you. Because some of us know what it's like when the people who should protect you decide you're not worth the cost.